In today's episode, the only content warning is my foul mouth. Hi, I'm Dr. Robin Watts, a foul-mouthed, keep-it-real clinical psychologist. Welcome to Not a Floating Head, a podcast focusing on entertaining topics involving psychology. The name of the podcast came about based on something I've said a million fucking times to medical doctors that I've worked with. The patient's symptoms cannot be all in their head. I've never had a floating head come in for therapy. What happens in your mind is going to affect your body, and what happens to your body is going to affect your mind. Your head is attached to your body. You are not a floating head. Thanks for joining me. Put on your adventuring pants and away we go. Hello, lovelies, and welcome to my first episode of my first podcast. I thought for the first podcast, I would start at the beginning with a question that's asked in every culture that has mental health practitioners. What is the difference between a psychologist, psychiatrist, and a therapist? In all honesty, this question sounds like the beginning of a joke, and I'm sure there are probably a few jokes out there that start like this. But seriously, if my own mother is still confused about whether I'm a psychologist or a psychiatrist, how can you be expected to know the difference? Well, I hope that after listening to this episode, you'll be able to explain the answer to my mother, and just maybe because you're not her daughter, she will finally listen and understand. Just kidding. Sorta. Oh shit. You gotta love that this is my first episode and I've already fallen under the psychology stereotype of mother bashing. But seriously, there will be no blaming mothers on this podcast, but there will be an episode on psychology stereotypes. Okay, I'm not going to bore you with a long history lesson on the emergence of psychiatry as a field of study and practice. If this is something you're interested in, then feel free to research it, but I want to keep this short and sweet so we can move on to more interesting and fun topics. The reason this question gets asked so often is because frequently the terms psychologist, psychiatrist, and therapist get used incorrectly and interchangeably. A very short history lesson is that psychiatry came first, then evolved into psychology, which then spread out even further to therapists and counselors. So let's start with psychiatrist. A psychiatrist is a medical doctor who specializes in mental disorders and chemical imbalances in the brain. Though psychiatry initially began as a combination of talk therapy and medication, it has changed over the years to mostly diagnosing and prescribing medications. Majority of psychiatrists do not engage in talk therapy and in fact do not have much training anymore in non-medication therapies such as talk therapy. However, there are always outliers, so do not send me angry messages if your psychiatrist provides talk therapy treatment and medication. That leads me to psychology. There are many different types of psychologists, but I'm going to focus on the most commonly referred to as a psychologist, which is a clinical psychologist. A clinical psychologist has a doctorate degree and is a doctor of psychology, not a medical doctor. What that means is that they've gone to school for several years and studied diagnoses and the many different types of talk therapy treatment. Additionally, licensed clinical psychologists are the only ones, at least that I know of in the US, who can perform and interpret psychological assessments and tests. They cannot prescribe medications. However, hold on to your hats because this is about to get a little confusing. There are a few exceptions where in extreme cases, such as rural areas with no available psychiatrist, some states within the US have allowed clinical psychologists to go to additional psychopharmacology training in order to prescribe medications. This is highly unusual and not the norm, and as I know, is only allowed in a few places in the US. Second thing that can be confusing if you've lived in multiple countries is that in the US, you can only be a psychologist or clinical psychologist if you have a doctorate in psychology. However, at least what I know of is that in New Zealand, you can be a psychologist, not a clinical psychologist, but a psychologist with a master's degree, which leads nicely into what is a therapist. A therapist is someone who has gone to school and obtained a master's degree in therapy. They may have a master's degree in social work and therapy, or a master's in family therapy, or some other equivalent degree. Like psychologists, they cannot prescribe medication, and their training is in delivering various talk therapy treatments. Basically, the only difference between a therapist and a clinical psychologist is their years of education and training. Lastly, I'm going to briefly mention counselors because I think it's important to know that a counselor is not the same as a therapist, although again, they're often used interchangeably. Counselors, like psychiatrists, psychologists, and therapists, must be licensed by a board, but their amount of education may vary, and their treatment plans will be more focused on short-term treatments. That doesn't mean that a counselor can't be good or beneficial. What a lot of my patients have told me is that they started out with a counselor, oftentimes it's more cost-effective, and found them helpful, but only up to a certain point. Once their symptoms or life challenges became more intense, the counselors appropriately referred them on to a therapist or clinical psychologist. In summary, psychiatrists mostly prescribe medications, clinical psychologists provide various talk therapy treatments, and perform psychological testing and assessments. Therapists have slightly less training than clinical psychologists, but also provide various talk therapy treatments, and counselors may or may not have less training than therapists, provide talk therapy, but with an emphasis on more simplified and shorter-term treatment plans. All of these professions must obtain a license and are accountable to a professional board. While this wasn't the most adventurous episode, I hope that you've gained some knowledge and enjoyed your time with me. Next episode, we're going to explore how to find the right therapist or clinical psychologist for you. The best way to support this podcast is to rate it and share it with others you think will enjoy it. If you have any questions or topics you'd like discussed in an episode, please reach out to me at notafloatinghead@gmail.com. Thanks again for spending time with me, and until next time, go have an adventure.